Hello to those who were able to join us. Thank you so much for making it to our event today, and thank you so much for caring about human rights in Egypt. Today, we have a vital and timely panel discussion with a brilliant group of experts. And discussion is important, especially ahead of the UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, to highlight the dire human rights situation in Egypt. And Egypt is also the host of the COP27 this year. We will be discussing some of the most recent groundwork done by Egyptian and international organizations on restrictions that violate the right to freedom of expression, assembly, and association, and threaten Egypt's ability to uphold its environmental and climate action commitments. Expert speakers will discuss the absence of fundamental human rights necessary for an effective civil society, therefore environmental CSOs, and the impact of targeting independent civil society, environmental, climate, and indigenous rights in Egypt. We will be also trying to answer the question of what stakeholders, governments, international human rights community can do to support rights detainees and push for a better respect for overall human rights in Egypt. The Committee for Justice, the organizer of this event, is part of a group of Egyptian and international human rights organizations that formed the Egyptian Human Rights Coalition on COP27 to amplify key civic space demands of the Egyptian human rights movement and demand the release of thousands of rights detainees in Egypt. For these efforts, this group of organizations have formed the coalition on COP27, furthering a petition carrying all these demands to the world, in which the coalition collected hundreds of signatures so far, and would be happy to post this petition for the audience today to share it within your network and show solidarity to the human rights movement in Egypt. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself. I am Yasmin Omar. I am a human rights lawyer and the UN and Regional Mechanisms Manager at CFJ, a member of the coalition on COP27. And to our brilliant panel of discussion, we have with us today Mr. Amr Magdi, a senior researcher in the Middle East and North Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. And he worked as a director of research at the Arab Network for Human Rights Information in Cairo. Thank you so much, Amr, for joining. Next to Amr, there is Ms. Samar Al-Husseini. She is an Egyptian human rights defender, and she is the communication and campaigns consultant at the Egyptian Human Rights Forum, which is a part of the Egyptian coalition on COP27. She is also a former executive director for Andalus Institute for Tolerance and Anti-Violence Studies and a member of Euromed Gender Working Group. Thank you so much for joining today. Summer. And last, we have Mr. Ahmed Salim, who is Dr. Ahmed Salim, who is the founding member and executive director of the Sinai Foundation for Human Rights. He is also a former faculty member at Al Arish University, the Sinai Foundation is working on is one of few independent Egyptian organizations that work to defend marginalized communities of Egypt North Sinai, particularly religious minorities, women, and children. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Ahmed. And we planned to have immediate interpretation from Arabic to English because some of our speakers will be speaking in Arabic. However, due to technicality, we couldn't switch the language channels. So our interpreter here will be offering interpretation right after our speakers are done with their interventions. So I'd like to start this conversation already with Mr. Amr Magdi and asking him about if he could give us an overview of the broad human rights concerns about COP27 being hosted by Egypt.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, for the introduction, and thanks everyone who is attending this event, and as Yasmin mentioned, showing care and interest in um, knowing about the human rights situation in Egypt and finding ways to support the civil society and human rights community. Um, I know my colleagues will talk later about specifics, including the situation of environmental groups and so on and so forth. But I think it's vital to start with speaking about the situation, the broader situation in the country, as Yasmin put it, because it's not also very possible to understand the situation when it comes to environmental issues and environmental groups without understanding the broader situation. Um, we have witnessed in Egypt in recent years, and particularly since 2013, one of the harshest crackdowns on civil society and independent groups in the country in recent history. In 2013, the current president, Abdel Fattah Sisi, who was then the defense minister, orchestrated a military coup and then was elected president in 2014 in a sham election. And since that time, his government has waged a wholesale nationwide crackdown on dissent, on all forms of dissent and criticism. This meant journalism, human rights defenders, civil society workers, women's rights defenders, LGBT people, and all and every kind of dissent, even the slightest critical voices who were actually supporting President Sisi and his government in the beginning, and maybe in later in the following years voiced some criticism, were also caught in that brutal kind of repression. Under his government, Egypt unfortunately became one of the top worst countries in the world in the numbers of jailed journalists. Just after China and Turkey and Myanmar, Egypt usually shows number 2 or 3 or 4 every single year since 2014 in the number of jailed journalists. The leading human rights organizations in the country and the leading activists have been under travel bans and asset freezes since 2016, virtually indefinite without any proper due process or court hearings. Many human rights organizations had to shut down or downscale their operations. Many repressive laws have been issued that curtail and impose severe restrictions on the work of the civil society organizations, including a 2017 law that Sisi himself said in a public speech later that it was the product of security paranoia. This 2017 NGO law actually provided for up to 5-year prison sentences for people who would violate the law provisions. But after Sisi's statement that this law was the product of security paranoia, the government replaced it with another law in 2019, which removed the prison sentences but kept in place almost all the draconian restrictions, including prohibition on doing independent work, research. NGOs are required to actually run any studies and programs by the government for approval first. The law also imposes a very severe and unduly convoluted process on registration, very severe restrictions on obtaining funds, whether domestic or from international sources. The product of all of these laws was a chilling message to civil society. We have never seen such a shrinking space for civil work in Egypt as we have seen in recent years under the government of President Sisi. His crackdown also, and very significantly, included and which is also relevant to COP, included the murder and mass killings of largely peaceful protesters and several incidents of mass killings and mass shootings against protesters who were mostly peaceful. This was in 2013, 2014, and in later years, we have witnessed mass arrests of protesters at every single occasion when there were street protests in Egypt, including most recently, maybe in 2018 and 2019 and 2020, when there were popular protests against corruption and the economic situation. The result is that we have tens of thousands of Egyptians who were prosecuted and arrested because of participation in protests since 2013. Many of them remain in jail without fair trials and in very dire prison conditions. The human rights situation in Egypt is frequently described by us and many other organizations as a crisis. It has been an uneasing, unrelenting crisis in the past 10 years almost. The government has taken very, very small steps, mostly not to actually.
I think we lost Amr for a second. I hope he can join us. Amr, we lost you for a second.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. What was the last thing you heard from me?
Well, we heard the last bit about practices from Egypt in regarding to COP.
Right. So I was saying that's why it's vitally important for participants in this in COP and people traveling to Egypt to press the Egyptian government to open up the civic space, allow participation not just in the COP but beyond the COP, and to just lift up these restrictions. I will leave it at this.
Yeah. We'll actually touch base on this in detail, and I will ask you this question. But thank you so much for the overview that you provided us, because this opens the door for the next question for Ms. Samar Al-Husseini. Well, your organization has been doing groundwork on environmental practices relating to opening up the civic space and the restrictions imposed on it. So we'd like you to tell us a little bit more in detail about what the type of restrictions that is facing the civic space and the civil organizations in Egypt, and could be imposed also around COP27, especially those who work on environmental issues, especially those covered in your report about urbanization of Saint Catherine, the natural preserve in Sinai.
Thank you, Yasmin, and thank you, Committee for Justice, for organizing this, and also thank you for the most of the attendees who are showing case that they care for the human rights situation in Egypt. Well, according to restriction on civil society, this is something that we need many times to speak about, but we can start from there. There is an overall situation in Egypt, shrinking civic space and shrinking spaces for civil society organization. As Amr mentioned about the law, about the restrictions on freedom of assembly and freedom of association, this didn't only touch upon the organizations that are working on human rights, like political or economic rights, but it also reached out to environmental and climate change organizations and activists. We have one of the heads of one of the environmental organization, Mr. Ahmed Amasha. He is detained since 2020 and is still in pre-trial detention. We don't know any specific time for when he will be released. Although his organization was working on the environmental issues, which is considered from the Egyptian government as, let's call it, a more low tone, right, that they would welcome more discussions about. But still, Mr. Ahmed Amasha, because his organization, or maybe the type of initiatives that they were doing, was able to mobilize and organize people for a certain cause. It doesn't matter what kind of cause. The idea that people can organize themselves, the idea that people can go together, do something, is kind of a threat for the Egyptian regime in a way. They consider whatever kind of a person who can actually reach out to audience, reach out to crowds, and make an impact is a direct threat. And this explains a lot of names are behind bars for unlimited time so far, like Ziad Al-Alimi or Ala Abdel Fattah. When we look at it from even the concept of what's happening, let's say in Saint Catherine, new project that the Egyptian government has announced in 2021. This project is actually it's called the Grand Transfiguration Project, a project that came out of nowhere, touching directly to a historical and ecologically important area. In the beginning, the government allocated a certain company that provided a very considerate project or plan for how to develop the area, taking into consideration the ecological and the societal and environmental impacts that could happen in this area. But the government felt that this is somehow an overpriced project or plan. And they decided to go with their own plan, kind of transferring this area into a mega touristic hub, opening a five-star hotel on the top of Mount Sinai, without any consideration for the natural preservant, for the rare species over there, even for the people who live in these neighborhoods, their life, how it is impacted, how this will impact the day-to-day life. People woke up in one of the days to find out that their graveyard has been demolished, and we had to go and collect the bones of their family members. Some people even were displaced because of the work of this project. The Egyptian government has announced that they would allow in the COP27 organizations to protest in a certain area. But the question is, would they allow the Egyptians suffering from the new project to protest against it, to protest about the severe dangers that they're going to see and have? Would they even protect these people after the COP? Because there is still a clear concern regarding what will happen after the COP, how the Egyptian government will deal with civil society organization, how it will deal with civil society activists. The project also, the report, in its way, was touching upon the fact that this project is only 100 kilos away from where the summit will be happening. And it kind of raises the question, would the state members attending this, an organization kind of enabling the Egyptian regime, helping them in their whitewash campaign about being an open country, a democratic whatever, or would they really raise questions and raise concerns about what's happening? We're speaking about an area that has been announced as a UNESCO heritage area for many years now. There has been a lot of damages that, according to experts, are not reversible that happened to this neighborhood. But even when it comes to the limitation on their organizations in during the era of COP27, I would call it an era, because of a lot of things are happening. Well, when you look at it, the overall thing has been a cherry-picking process, starting from the registration process, which was chaotic, gloomy, non-transparent. When you go even to the COP27 website right now, you can't know who are the partners. The section for partners are not even open. You don't know them. There's no single Egyptian organization registered on the website, or their name is mentioned, or the effort of civil society is mentioned in any way on how they have participated in the COP or raised the question regarding climate change. When you look even on not only on the registration process, but also when you look into the type of information going out about the COP, who will attend, who will not attend, what are the criteria? Would the civil society and international experts be allowed to enter the country without security screening, or would they be deported from the airport? We have witnessed this happen several times in Egypt. Now, even people inside Egypt are not allowed in some certain cases to go beyond the checkpoint and go to Sinai, even to enjoy some time. We have a recent case of Abdurrahman Tariq, who was sent back from Sinai checkpoint, and he was going just to relax. So the restrictions is kind of an overall situation that is going from the general aspect, that general approach that the Egyptian government is adapting, and reaching out to how they're even managing this COP27. I hope I didn't take more than my allocated time.
No
Okay.
worries. Thank you so much for the important context, Summer, because now we know that people who participate in COP could just go 1 kilometer to see how development plans are taking over natural preservation and how it's impacting the indigenous people of Sinai. And speaking of the indigenous people, thank you so much for giving us the cue for our next question with our guest, Mr. Ahmed Salim, and a question, of course, on Sinai and respecting indigenous people in indigenous area. How did the securitization of Sinai, that is in part for COP27, and in another part it has been the case for years, how this securitization is shrinking the role of non-military state institutions and how it contributes to the crushing of civil society and its engagement with its environmental, political, and human rights issues in Sinai. Mr. Ahmed Salem will answer in English, in Arabic, and our interpreter is going to provide a swift translation after he's done. You're muted.
اوكي. شكرا جزيلا ياسمين على المقدمة، وشكرا للزملاء ولكل الضيوف الحضور لاهتمامهم بالقضايا الحقوقية في مصر والقضايا البيئية، وكمان شكرا ل Committee for Justice لتنظيم هذا الايفنت. في البداية من بداية 2013 وحتى الآن، يعني السؤال بتاعك كان توصيف جيد لما يحدث في مصر بشكل عام من سحق للمجتمع المدني، اللي سيناء شهدت أضعاف مضاعفة ليه. يعني لم توجد أي مساحة للحركة داخل سيناء، لم يكن هناك أي صوت سوى صوت الرصاص من بداية العمليات العسكرية في سيناء من 2013. السلطات المصرية تعاملت مع مسألة سيناء كقضية أمنية فقط. المقاربة الأمنية سيطرت على المشهد، ولم يسمح بأي يعني لأي منظمات مجتمع مدني مستقلة أو حتى مؤسسات صحفية من العمل في سيناء. وكل الناس اللي حاولت ان هي توجد مساحه حتى ولو محدوده للعمل داخل شبه الجزيره تم التعامل معهم بسياسه العصا الغليظه. عندنا امثله كتير على هذا الامر، ربما ابرزهم اسماعيل اسكندراني الباحث والصحفي الشهير في شؤون سيناء، واللي تم اعتقاله وتلفيق قضية هزلية جدا ليه وسجنه بحكم لمدة 10 سنوات في قضية ملفقة لم يكن لها أي سبب إلا محاولة إظهار صوت آخر وصورة مختلفة عن الرواية الرسمية لما يحدث داخل شبه جزيرة سيناء، اللي حرصت الحكومة المصرية من اليوم الأول على إغلاقها وأمام الصحفيين واحتكار الرواية الإعلامية واحتكار يعني الصورة منعت تماما خروجها من سيناء. حتى فيما يخص مسألة المؤتمر أو قمة المناخ الكاب 27 اللي هتجرى في نوفمبر القادم، يعني من خلال عملنا ورصدنا لما يجري، مفيش في قاعدة بيانات منظمات المجتمع المدني اللي هتشارك في المؤتمر أي منظمة مصرية بتتخذ من سينا مقر ليها، بالإضافة إلى أنه يعني في الصحافة والإعلام في مسألة التفاعل مع الكاب تقريبا ما فيش أي منظمة يعني تتخذ من سينا مقر ليها يعني قدمت أي مساهمة في الإعداد للمؤتمر، إلا ربما خبر عن جمعية واحدة هي مقربة من الحكومة المصرية بالأساس، بتشتغل بالتنسيق مع مكتب محافظة شمال سيناء. بالتالي مسألة القطيعة مع المجتمع المدني بشكل عام في مصر، وإن كان زي ما قلت القمع في سيناء هو أضعاف مضاعفة نتيجة وحشية المؤسسات الحكومية في التعامل مع المجتمع المدني بشكل عام وفي سيناء بشكل خاص. الجيش بيشرف بشكل شبه كامل على إدارة الحياة في سيناء سياسيا واقتصاديا. تقريبا ما فيش أي يعني جهة حكومية تتعامل مع المدنيين لها تواجد، يعني من بداية الأحداث حتى المحكمة والجهات القضائية اللي كانت موجودة في شمال سيناء تم نقلها خارج المحافظة، وبالتالي وبالتالي مسألة التظلم للسكان المحليين ومحاولة التعامل مع المحامي العام أو من ينوب عنه مش موجودة في المحافظة. الجيش فرض قيود كبيرة جدا على كل الوسائل حتى الاتصال. تم قطع الشبكات لفترات طويلة، وبالتالي آم، مسألة العمل المدني كان الصورة اللي صدرتها الدولة للمجتمع المدني إنه أي محاولة لكسر هذا الجمود وكسر هذا الصمت سيتم التعامل معها بعصا غليظة للغاية. تم اعتقال صحفيين وإحالتهم للمحاكمة العسكرية، حتى وإن كانوا بيشتغلوا في صحف قريبة من الحكومة، زي الصحفي أحمد أبو دراع في 2013 تم إرساله للمحكمة العسكرية. جرى اعتقال العديد من النشطاء السيناويين، حاولوا كسر هذا الجمود من خلال محاولات في أشكال محلية. في سيناء يوجد ما يسمى بالدواوين الشعبية أو المجالس الشعبية بتلجأ ليها العائلات لتنظيم يعني تجمعات لمناقشة الآراء في سواء كانت تتعلق بمشاكل محلية أو مشاكل عائلية. هذا الأمر تم إغلاقه تماما وفرض قيود عليه لما حاول بعض النشطاء السيناويين أو السياسيين في سيناء عام 2017 الاعتراض على بيان من وزارة الداخلية بإعلان يعني مقتل خلية إرهابية كانت في الأصل عبارة عن مجموعة من المعتقلين. خرجت مظاهرات كبيرة يمكن لأول مرة من بداية الأحداث عام 2017 في مدينة العريش، وتم تأسيس ما يسمى باللجنة الشعبية في العريش. تم يعني عقب هذه المظاهرات الحكومة المصرية لم تنسى هذا الأمر وقامت بمعاقبة هؤلاء النشطاء بالسجن. الناشط السياسي أشرف الحفني وأشرف أيوب تم إرسالهم للسجن وحبسهم احتياطيا لمدة تزيد عن العام، وتعرضهم لظروف احتجاز غير إنسانية فقط بسبب رفع الصوت أو محاولة القيام بأي يعني بنشاط يعني ينتمي للمجتمع المدني.
Yes, that was the end of it. And thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed Salim. This is not surprising hearing about Sinai's treatment and the indigenous people in Sinai's treatment, given that they are only located in an area where so much is going on security-wise. And maybe the reason is so much neglection that these people are suffering. But well, everybody has been speaking about the closure of civic space, and maybe this is a good time to touch up on it with Mr. Amr Magdi. Your report has the Human Rights Watch recent report on Cop27 regarding civil society participation touch on that very heavily, and we'd like to hear about the impact of the closure of civic space and how it affects the environmental movement in Egypt, and what should the Egyptian government do to enable full, meaningful participation in COP27?
Thank you, Yasmin. Yes, Human Rights Watch released a report focusing on the crackdown on Egypt's environmental groups. As I mentioned, this is not possible to understand without putting this in the context of the larger crackdown on civil society in Egypt since 2013. Environmental groups are part of Egypt's civil society. They have been subject to the same severe restrictions, but maybe also to give a little bit of a context about the environmental space in Egypt. Since or after the 2011 uprising, nationwide revolution against former President Mubarak, civic space in Egypt really opened in a very nice way to all possibilities. The society was very dynamic. There were a lot of young people engaging in different forms of activism, including political, human rights, or any form basically of public engagement. This also meant the sphere for environmental groups widened. They increased in numbers. They increased in the topics they were covering, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, this was quickly reversed from 2013 and 2014 when the current government came to power and reversed all the gains of the popular uprising in 2011. the environmental space in Egypt and people, usually people who choose to work in environmental space, maybe they were not really ready for such brutal crackdown and harsh confrontation with the Egyptian government, because unlike other topics, for example, uh, if you are an activist and decide to engage on topics like torture or enforced disappearance or other security forces abuses, you know this will likely provoke the government and provoke their brutal agencies, and they will come after you. So you're kind of prepared somehow for such crackdown, and maybe you have already made your calculations about the price you're going to pay as an activist. But if you are an environmental activist and try to work on air pollution, for example, maybe you were not really having such brutal crackdown in mind when you started your activism. So I feel, having researched this topic, um, the impact of such heavy and brutal crackdown on environmental groups in Egypt maybe was even heavier, deeper than the impact on other human rights organizations and NGOs that focus mainly on human rights issues. Um, Bearing in mind that actually some organizations combine both and work in both fields together, have divisions and staff who have expertise in both issues or both domains. Um, but the impact on environmental groups was really devastating. Many of them shut down or had to downscale their operations or left the country. Obviously, the majority of them stopped doing research work because that's maybe, excuse me, maybe somehow that's one of the most risky things, not just for the activists or campaigners themselves, but for people that you meet with and residents affected by climate and issues like air pollution. Uh, Residents were open, and lay people, average people were open to interact with components of Egypt's civil society in 2011 and 2013. But after that, with the harsh government crackdown, everyone knew that talking to the press, talking to an activist, talking to an investigator doing some research work means that the government will go after you. And that happened in 2016 in one of the campaigns about air pollution in Alexandria. The government did not only threaten the activists doing the research and campaign work, but also residents who interacted with them, and some were arrested and threatened with terrorism charges. So the impact is an environment of fear and intimidation that everyone lives in. And the message was clear that doing crucial environmental work means risking going to prison, means risking having your assets frozen as an individual or as an organization, and means travel bans and other forms of reprisals and punishment by the security agencies in Egypt. When it comes to participation in COP, I think the government was caught in a delicate situation because basically the government of President Sisi has killed the Egyptian civil society in previous years. Suddenly, they are hosting a global conference in which thousands of independent activists gather every year to voice their opinions. And it would be very embarrassing for the Egyptian government to suddenly be to host a conference without representation from the Egyptian civil society. So what happened in previous month, according to our research, is that the Egyptian government, mainly the Foreign Ministry and security agencies and the Environment Ministry, have organized closed meetings with some environmental groups and invited them to participate in the COP around welcome territories and welcome areas, which means basically areas that intersect with the interests of the Egyptian government when it comes to global, climate finance, loss and damage, and the historical grievances of the global south against global north and industrial countries. These topics, when it mostly revolve around global climate advocacy, and it intersects with the interests of the Egyptian government, which usually portrays itself as a champion of the global south. And usually the Egyptian narrative, the official narrative of Egypt around climate issues is not necessarily bad. But the Egyptian government wouldn't allow these groups to speak about Egypt's domestic environmental issues, wouldn't allow them to campaign about fossil fuels, about the impact of tourism industry on the environment, about the vast and opaque military businesses in the country, which Egypt's military run and own huge businesses, including infrastructure projects that definitely impact the environment, but we are not allowed to research these topics or ask questions about them. So this is briefly the impact on environmental groups. And I think everyone also fears reprisals following the COP. So it's not just about what's during the COP or before, but there is a level of self-censorship because everyone knows they could be subject to security reprisals following the COP.
Thank you so much, Amr, and providing this context about that. It's not just about human rights. Well, environmental rights fall in the middle of everything that is human rights. And this concept is sometimes misleading for environmental activists or states that are participating in COP. And that leads me to my second question to Samar. Well, about COP participants and UN state members' responsibility about grave human rights abuses in Egypt, knowing that they are coming to discuss one of the gravest crises that the humanity is facing. However, this is happening on a land that is basically lawless. So, do you think they're responsible? What can they do?
Well, of course. I think like participating puts a lot of responsibility on the shoulder of each participant who will be allowed to go to Egypt for sure, and each organization or a member state delegation that would be there, they need to put in mind that this will be used as a whitewash campaign. This will be used to show a face of the Egyptian regime that is not there. The Egyptian regime has been trying to show this openness image, releasing some names. We're speaking about almost 200, while there are almost 60,000 are behind bars. In the same moment, there's a national dialogue. There is a full image that is kind of presented to the international society that Egypt is welcoming you. Egypt is moving towards more open and more modern civil society and space for organization and activists to work. But this is not true. The numbers of people behind bars says the opposite. The number of organizations that were not allowed to even attend the COP says the opposite. The risk and the threats that people are taking on their shoulders in order to participate in any way, or even as Amr said, even self-censorship because they're afraid from what will happen to them, puts a lot of responsibility on the shoulder of the participant. I think it's important that they raise questions about the human rights record, about people behind bar, about the political prisoners and prisoners of conscience, about the environmental issues in Egypt. How come a country like Egypt, even we have this joke about Egypt and cutting trees, how come a country like this is hosting such a huge summit on such a huge and dangerous topic? We're speaking also I think they need also to call for the release of people behind bar, political prisoners. It's really hard that you go to a country to enjoy the nice beaches of Sharm el-Sheikh, and you know that there are people in jail. They are tortured. There is ill treatment. There are people who doesn't have access to to doctors or even health support. It's really hard. If I am there, it would be very hard for me to enjoy the moment, even try to think about the environmental issues while these people are suffering in such kind of level. I think even the UN member states needs to make a clear statement ahead of the conference, ahead of the summit itself, that our participation doesn't mean that we support such a regime. It doesn't mean that we agree on the human rights violations happening in Egypt. Uh, Also, it has to have they had to call for opening the civic space, giving more space for freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. These are, for me, I consider them as tools. You cannot make any change. You cannot engage people in any kind of a change process without having a like the key freedoms that will give them the tools to express their mind, to be more actively participating in public sphere. If you are frightening, if you're worried that if you participated in a protest you will get caught, or you will get arrested, or even you will get intimidated later by the security, you will not be very encouraged to go and participate even on the environmental issues. I think it would be important for people who will go also to remind the government in public events about certain names, about people who have been suffering, about the suffering of the Egyptian people, even on the economic and environmental level. It shouldn't be used as a campaigning for the a new face of the Egyptian regime. And right now we're speaking about this summit which is happening in Egypt. Next year it's happening in Emirates. So there is a whole question about what kind of countries are actually picked for these summits. I think the human rights record of any country should be a criteria for choosing this country to host whatever kind of an international summit. I wouldn't take more of the time again. So.
Thank you so much, Samar. And you and Amr provided a great hook to speaking about a narrative and countering it, providing our story and our narrative, and we try to show those stakeholders that they are in fact responsible for doing something about grave human rights. And speaking of narratives, I'll go back to discuss how the state is representing indigenous rights and environmental rights, taking us back to the example of Sinai, in which I will ask Mr. Ahmed Salim that yes, it seems that the notion of protecting and advancing indigenous communities is absent in Egypt. People of Sinai and people, the Nubians, do not have special identification as indigenous, and that they are required to have a voice and be represented as indigenous in front of the state. Why should we stress during this COP this year, COP27, that the Nubian and the Sinai population are indigenous population and they are of historically marginalized areas? How does this description help, if it's used during COP27, shed the light on relevant human rights violations and issues in these areas?
جميل. خلينا في البداية ياسمين يعني نقول إنه مصطلح الشعوب الأصلية هو مش مصطلح في المقام الأول، هو مش مصطلح سياسي ملوش أي مدلولات ربما بتنظر ليها الحكومة المصرية وغيرها من الحكومات الديكتاتورية على إنه مصطلح ربما بيعبر عن أهداف ليها، أهداف سياسية أو انفصالية أو ما شابه. مصطلح حتى السكان الأصليين ورد ذكره في وثائق حكومية مصرية، بعضها حديث مثل وثيقة مرتبطة بالخطة البيئية لمحافظة جنوب سيناء عام 2005 و2006 أو 2004 و2005. لكن هل ينطبق مصطلح الشعوب الأصلية على سكان شبه جزيرة سيناء أو النوبة؟ ده سؤال أحب أن أنا أجاوب عنه في الأول، لأنه أعتقد بشكل كبير أنه هذا المصطلح ينطبق بشكل كبير جدا على السكان أو سكان شبه جزيرة سيناء والنوبة. في البداية القانون الدولي ما بيعرفش مصطلح الشعوب الأصلية تعريف محدد أو جامع، ولكن ترك مسألة يعني هذا التعريف يعني المسألة الذاتية، إنه المجتمع يعبر أو يرى نفسه بهذه الصورة، التعريف الذاتي، مبدأ التعريف الذاتي. وهذا الأمر ينطبق بشدة على سكان شبه جزيرة سيناء اللي دايما تجدي هذا المصطلح على لسان سكانها، أيضا مرتبط بحجم المظالم والتهميش التاريخي والتمييز اللي تعرض له هذا المجتمع. أيضا المبادئ الواردة في المعايير الأفريقية لحقوق السكان الأصليين بتركز على مسألة التميز الثقافي واستمرارية التواجد في يعني في منطقة جغرافية لفترة طويلة، والانعزال الجغرافي، وتعرض هؤلاء السكان لفترة طويلة من التمييز والتهميش. وكل هذه المبادئ أو المعايير تنطبق بشكل كبير على سكان شبه جزيرة سيناء. ليه بيساعد النظر لسكان شبه جزيرة سيناء أو النوبة يعني كسكان أصليين على رفع يعني قضاياهم الحقوقية أو البيئية أو مظالمهم التاريخية؟ لأنه زي ما قلت انه الاعلان الاممي بشان حقوق السكان او الشعوب الاصليين، او حتى الاعلان الافريقي يوجد به العديد من الضمانات اللي بتضمن عدم تعرض هؤلاء السكان للكثير من الممارسات اللي هي للاسف وقعت بشكل كبير خلال الفترة من 2013 ل 2022 أو حتى الآن في شبه جزيرة سيناء. زي مثلا انه الماده الثامنه في الاعلان الاممي بشان حقوق الشعوب الاصليه بيؤكد على عدم تعرض الشعوب الاصليه للدمج القسري او تدمير ثقافتهم. طبعا العكس تماما حصل في سيناء، جرى تهجير يعني عشرات الآلاف من السكان المحليين وإجبارهم على الاندماج في مجتمعات مختلفة تماما عن ثقافتهم وهويتهم الاجتماعية. الأمر الثاني مسألة نزع الملكية. الإعلان الأممي أو المادة الثامنة تحديدا في الإعلان الأممي الخاص بحقوق الشعوب الأصلية بيؤكد على عدم نزع ملكية الأراضي من السكان الأصليين، وحتى إن وجدت الضرورة لمثل هذا الأمر يجب تعويضهم بأرض مقابل أرض، وهو يعني الأمر الذي حدث عكسه تماما في شبه جزيرة سيناء. إنه الحكومة كان لديها يعني ممارسات أشبه بالعقيدة، يعني في مسألة التهجير، تارة بمبررات أمنية وتارة أخرى بمبررات لها علاقة بالتنمية في سيناء. لذلك بيتم التحجج، أو الدولة بتتحجج بأنه بيتم نزع الملكية كمان من بعض هؤلاء الناس في سيناء بسبب عدم امتلاكهم لعقود تملك للأراضي، بسبب أنهم بعض أصولهم أو بعض هؤلاء السكان أصولهم ليست مصرية. والحقيقة أنه الإعلان الأممي الخاص بحقوق الشعوب الأصلية بيؤكد على أنه مسألة ملكية الأراضي في الخاص بالسكان الأصليين أو الشعوب الأصلية ليس فقط المحدد فيه هو الأوراق والعقود، ولكن مسألة التواجد طويل الأمد أو الاستخدام طويل الأمد بالإقامة والزراعة والحق في الاستخدام. والواقع بيقول لنا أنه سكان شبه جزيرة سيناء تواجدوا في هذه المناطق قبل قيام الدولة المصرية عام 52، أو حتى قبل نشأة الشهر العقاري عام 1946. وبالتالي ما يحدث أو الإجراءات التي قامت بها السلطات المصرية خالفت فيها كل هذه المبادئ. وبالتالي مسألة يعني النجاح في التعامل أو إلزام الحكومة المصرية بالتعامل مع سكان شبه جزيرة سيناء أو النوبة على كونهم سكان أو شعوب أصلية بيعطيهم يعني كثير من الحقوق، وبيلزم الحكومة بالكثير من الضمانات لحفظ حقوق هؤلاء السكان اللي تعرضوا خلال السنوات اللي فاتت لحملة كبيرة من التهجير القسري ونزع الملكية والسجن والإخفاء القسري لآلاف السكان في شبه جزيرة سيناء في سجون سرية لا غير خاضعة للرقابة القضائية، وتحويل شبه جزيرة سيناء إلى ملكية خاصة بالجيش عبر قرارات رئاسية بتحيل كل السلطات في شبه جزيرة سيناء لوزير الدفاع، له الحق في يعني إصدار قرارات خاصة بالتهجير القسري، حظر التجول، منع التنقل، وغيرها من القرارات التي كرست السلطات في شبه الإلهية في يد شخص واحد وعبثت بمقدرات سيناء، ويعني قامت بالعديد من المشاريع حتى دون إعلان أو نشر دراسات أثر بيئي اللي بيلزم الدستور المصري الحكومة المصرية بإجرائها، وفي الغالب هي بتقوم بنشرها، لكن في شبه جزيرة سيناء لا يوجد أي نشر. الأمر اللي بيضع كثير من علامات الاستفهام حول يعني البعد البيئي لهذه المشاريع، وآخرها مشروع تطوير ميناء العريش اللي كان فيه تصريحات متضاربة بين المسؤول السابق لجهاز أو تنمية إقليم قناة السويس، الفريق مهاب مميش، اللي من سنتين قال إنه هذا الميناء لن يتم تطويره أو التوسع فيه بسبب إنه هو ميناء صيد تجاري ومحدود، وإنه الدراسات ما بتقولش إنه مناسب لأنه محاط بكتلة سكانية. فوجئنا بعدها بسنتين بقرار رئاسي بيهجر 20,000 مدني، 6,000 أسرة، دون نشر دراسة تقييم أثر بيئي، في وجود حالة كبيرة أو يعني ظاهرة مرصودة لزيادة النحر في شواطئ شمال سيناء وتراجع ثروة النخيل بسبب الممارسات الحكومية غير المسؤولة، رغم رصد المحافظة أو التقارير المنشورة من محافظة شمال سيناء اللي بتلزم الحكومة لوضع يعني إجراءات تقلص من هذه الظواهر. شكرا.
Thank you so much, Sundus, and thank you, Mr. Ahmed Salim, for a unique context on Sinai. We wouldn't have known this if it wasn't for your participation today. And it's scary to see how the state is hosting the most vital conversation about the environment and about protecting indigenous population, is treating its own indigenous population this way. It's not only the Sinai people, but also the Nubians has been suffering from decades of marginalization and neglect for their right and for their right to their lands that has been used for by the state without compensation. This could use another event, of course, to address the rights of indigenous people, but now remains one important question ahead of COP that is in a few weeks, actually. What can stakeholders do? Stakeholders, the United Nations, the international civil society, the human rights community, and UN state members who are going to be participating in COP27. What do we call on them to do to support the Egyptian civil society movement and the victims of human rights violations? I'll start by Summer.
Okay, well, there are several issues here. I think there are things that we have to think about in the long term, and there are things that has to be done like immediately before attending the COP itself. I would start with the long-term issues. I think what happened when it comes to civil society organization experiences, what happened in the COP civic alliance that has been recently done, and Committee for Justice has been very kind to launch its website lately. The coalition has brought the attention to a very important aspect of the cross-movement support and solidarity. How human rights organizations and environmental organizations can come together, because in a way you cannot achieve any progress in any of the human rights topics or climate change topics without like being supportive to each other, without collaboration on the different levels. Environmental activists are targeted in Egypt the same like like political and economic rights activists are targeted. So in a way, I think this is a good experience, a good lesson for us to build on, to keep the momentum on how this kind of a cross movement and intersection between the civil society groups can actually make a good impact, can draw the international society attention to the situation of human rights in Egypt. I think the environmental organization who will attend this the COP27 and will collaborate to raise the topics of political prisoners, calling for opening civic space, they will be well, I don't know how to articulate it, but I think it's something that the Egyptian government didn't expect. They expected this to be a very domesticated conference. They wouldn't find any resistance. They wouldn't be questioned about what's happening, what they're doing, the human rights record in Egypt. So the success to change the narrative, change the discussion and speech about, no, you cannot get away with that. still it's on the table. It is, you will be asked in every public event about people in jail. You will be asked about freedoms. You would be asked about opening civic space and allowing people to politically participate on a different level. So I think this might be a long and a short term issue for sure. And the second thing I would say, also it's a long term one, but also the UN could, on the long term, I think a human rights record should be a criteria for any kind of activity the UN is supporting or choosing countries to host or collaborating with. You cannot keep kind of rewarding countries like Egypt, like even Emirates, Qatar. All these countries, they have horrible human rights record, and still you are giving them an actual economic opportunity. While the summit, considered a very vital summit for climate change, it's also an economic opportunity. You're kind of, in a different way, supporting a regime that is actually killing its people. Like extrajudicial killing is happening in Sinai. It has been happening in since ever. You have you are supporting a regime that putting people in jail. Okay, I will try to to some.
No, didn't want to interrupt you, but I agree with you, and we'd like also to allow time for our audience to ask questions. So
course.
you may have for our audience, you can send questions in the chat now while I hear from Mr. Ahmed Salem also in like 3 minutes to allow translation, and then we'll take Amr's overall. I know he has a lot to answer to this question. Mr. Ahmed, you're muted.
Yeah. اوكي. شكرا يا ياسمين. انا يعني مش هقول كتير مختلف عن زميلتي سمر. هي مسألة انه على الشورت تيرم انه من ال يعني آه، انه غير مناسب اطلاقا من وجهة نظري انه يكون مكان انعقاد المؤتمر هو سيناء او شرم الشيخ، اللي هي على بعد يعني عشرات الكيلومترات من مكان ارتكبت فيه جرائم حرب وتم التنكيل بالسكان المحليين لفترات طويلة في ظل التحلل كامل لمؤسسات الدولة وإغلاق المجال قدام منظمات المجتمع المدني. يجب على المنظمات الحقوقية والبيئية المستقلة اللي هتشارك في المؤتمر من وجهة نظري إنه تاخد بعين الاعتبار مكان انعقاد المؤتمر وتخصص جزء من أنشطتها ووقتها لمناقشة قضايا يعني سكان هذه المنطقة. كمان انه الحكومات اللي هتشارك في المؤتمر يجب ان هي توصل رسالة للحكومة المصرية واضحة جدا ما فيهاش اي لبس على انه يجب فتح المجال العام امام منظمات المجتمع المدني وكف العصا الغليظة اللي بتتعامل بها الحكومة مع النشطاء الحقوقيين والبيئيين. على اللونج تيرم انا شايف انه زي ما سمر قالت يجب انه يكون يجب انه ربط ملف او سجل مصر في حقوق الانسان بكافه يعني التعامل مع الحكومه المصريه على كل المستويات، بمعنى انه يجب على الحكومات الحليفة لمصر والمعنية خصوصا منها المعنية بحقوق الإنسان إن هي تضمن يعني وجود آلية تفرض نوع من أنواع الرقابة على مسألة تصدير السلاح إن اضطروا لتصديره يعني لاعتبارات خاصة بهم. ولكن يجب على الحكومات إن هي تضمن يعني وضع آلية شفافة وعلنية للربط تصدير السلاح للحكومة المصرية وربطه بملف حقوق الإنسان. يجب أنه تضغط هذه الدول أو حتى المنظمات المستقلة العاملة في هذه الدول الحليفة للنظام المصري على إصدار تقارير علنية عن مسألة تصدير السلاح اللي تم في فترة النزاع المسلح في سيناء والتحقيق فيما إذا تم استخدام هذا السلاح في انتهاكات ضد السكان. ويجب أن يتم استغلال هذه الفرصة الحالية للضغط على النظام المصري زي ما قلت من أجل فتح المجال العام والسماح لمنظمات المجتمع المدني والصحافة المستقلة للعمل داخل شبه جزيرة سيناء.
And at the end, I'd like to ask the same question to Amr Magdi. Amr, what do we expect from states attending COP to be? Do we expect them to address the human rights issue in Egypt? And what should they do if you can send them a message?
Thank you. Maybe just to be clear and to avoid any confusions, we are not calling for any sort of boycott or refraining from participation, because we know this conference is maybe the most important opportunity to discuss climate issues and climate talks globally. It is important for the whole planet and for the humanity. And what we are calling for here is for participants from civil society to find ways to amplify the voice of the repressed, severely repressed Egyptian civil society, to find opportunities to link environmental issues to human rights issues, because the Egyptian government and other authoritarian governments always try to create this artificial fracture between human rights and environmental rights, which is not true. And there is no climate justice without real civic space and without human rights. So this is the message for civil society. There are so many ways to do this to amplify the voice of the Egyptian civil society and human rights community, and they can always get in touch with the Egyptian human rights groups to find ways to cooperate or to ask for any ideas and thoughts. The other message is for official delegations from state, particularly states that have close ties with the Egyptian government. Most of them, and in most of our advocacy meetings, that at least talking about the ones I've participated in, which are dozens in recent years, no one actually, usually diplomats never push back against our assessment when it comes to the dire human rights situation in the country. But then when it comes to action and what could be done, there is always this reluctance to do something and to send a clear message to the Egyptian government, or even to publicly criticize grave abuses. Their presence in Egypt will be an opportunity to raise these concerns directly with the Egyptian officials, and to meet with components of the Egyptian civil society, whether in Sharm el-Sheikh or Cairo. We are calling on delegations to actually visit Cairo, visit the Egyptian NGOs that are deprived and unable from participating in COP, and other signs and other signals, sending other signals of solidarity to the Egyptian civil society in groups. When it comes to UN agencies, the UN aftermath, as someone mentioned, needs for the long term to actually develop criteria, human rights criteria, for hosting climate summits in the future, in order to avoid this situation we are in now in Egypt and next year in the UAE. It is important for the climate talks and for the climate justice that these talks are held in space where civil society participation is not hindered, and when people's voices are heard. It is important for other UN agencies, for example, the High Commission for Human Rights and special mechanisms working on different human rights aspects. And I know some of them will be in Egypt, to also send a clear message. And I was blessed to see the statement by 5 special rapporteurs yesterday or the day before about civic space in Egypt. It is important to keep the pressure mounting on the Egyptian government to open the civic space and to document abuses, including the any delays in the visa process, and any crackdown on protesters, any shrinking space for participation, surveillance, digital surveillance issues, and so on and so forth. I think it's important for the UN agencies to be engaged, to be vigilant, and to be proactive. So there is a lot to be done, and the situation is not, I would say, the Egyptian government usually is liable to international pressure. And unfortunately, a lot of the abuses, as Ahmed mentioned, that happened and that were committed by the Egyptian government in recent years were partially allowed because of the international silence on the human rights situation in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amr. And as you said, there is a lot to be done and a lot to be said, especially some emergent cases that need immediate interference. Ala Abdel Fattah, the Egyptian human rights defender, is in imminent danger to lose his life due to lengthy hunger strike that is not acknowledged by the Egyptian government nor the British government, as he is a dual national. So there are a lot to be done immediately, and we hope to see not to be left with a legacy that the world is turned their faces away from us. And given the opportunity, we are receiving questions from our audience. And the first question is, what is the purpose of the national dialogue? Is it just a facade to distract the population and international community? On the national dialogue, I know all of you are experts, so I don't know who would like to start answering this question, given that there is a lot to say about it. I'll take answers from all of you. I'll start with Mr. Ahmed Salem, just to give the translation sometime.
أنا يعني هخلي عمري يجاوب السؤال عن السؤال ده يجاوبه بشكل أفضل وعشان كمان وقت الترجمة
Thank you so much. Well,
عفوا.
Amr, you are by proxy answering for you and for Mr. Ahmed Salem.
Thank you. It's an important question. I think so far this so-called national dialogue has produced nothing concrete in terms of revising or producing a holistic approach to address the human rights crisis in the country and reverse, oppressive laws and the damage that has been happening for almost 10 years now. And in my opinion, the real dialogue should happen between citizens in the street, in public transport, in the schools, workplaces. And this will not happen with the current harsh oppression. People are afraid to speak, are afraid to raise their voices or share their honest opinions because they know there are security repercussions for that. And that's the real dialogue that's not happening in Egypt. So the real dialogue is not just a bunch of elite people, with all due respect to all of them, and many of them are actually our friends and our colleagues. But the real dialogue is not just between a group of elite discussing things, behind closed doors or whatever. And so far, even the government is not pretending and is not saying that this dialogue is sort of a political negotiation with the opposition to produce something concrete. It's merely some experts, some members of the elite who will produce some recommendations for the Egyptian government that will it will be up on the government then to say we take these recommendations or leave them. And let's not forget that many aspects of the human rights crisis in Egypt does not need a dialogue, does not need a process. There is no need for such lengthy process that takes months and years to release the thousands of unjustly detained prisoners. And there is no need for such process to reverse oppressive laws when it comes to the 2013 law prohibiting protests or the 2019 law that is curtailing the work of NGOs or unblocking the websites can happen overnight. There are almost 700 news websites blocked in Egypt. So all of these things can happen with just pushing the enter button on the keyboard of someone in the security agencies or in the president's office. So I highly doubt so far the outcome of this dialogue. And I think so far it has been meant for, unfortunately, to spread the false narrative that the country is open or that there is a process of dialogue going on before COP, while actually producing nothing concrete to change the situation.
Thank you so much, Amr. The truth is apparent, apparently, for everyone. However, we need experts like you to break it down for us. And Summer, I know you have more to say about it.
Well, I wouldn't add more to what Amr already said, but to be honest, I wouldn't call it even a national dialogue. I wouldn't even call it a dialogue, because the overall process of launching a national dialogue, it needs an independent entity to launch it. It needs an impartial entity to launch it. This didn't happen in Egypt. It needs more context that should be there, more openness. There has to be some pre-steps to the national dialogue. As Amr was saying, there are some things that needs to be changed by certain entering or certain decision. These steps has to be taken first in order to open the space for an actual national dialogue. You cannot conduct a national dialogue without including all political powers, without including Egyptians in the diaspora. Groups of Egyptians in the diaspora are excluded. Certain political forces, which is very popular in the Egyptian society, has been excluded under different reasons. So I wouldn't even call it a national dialogue. For me, it's kind of a maneuver from the Egyptian government. Uh, Over the last 8 years, the government has been all the time waving the topic of economic and social rights in order to diverse the conversation from political and civic rights. Right now, they have a clear crisis when it comes to economic and social rights. So they're trying to draw the attention to political. Okay, let's play a little bit with political and civic rights and discuss it till we can divert this crisis or find a solution in a way. So I'm not that optimistic about it even.
None. No one who I have asked was optimistic. Well, at the end, we are doing everything we can do, and we are hoping that we've seen the solidarity from the world for our work and our seeking of a better life for all Egyptian people, and especially those who are facing reprisal because of their defending human rights. We don't have any more questions from our audience. And at this time, I'd like to thank our speakers. I think Amr Magdi, before I thank you, you have a word to say.
Yes, thank you. I mean, maybe just to end with a positive note, I think there are definitely reasons to be optimistic and reasons to keep our hope that the situation will change, not as the result of um, maneuvers that lack sincerity, but because of the efforts of the brave human rights defenders and activists in the country who are defending their values, defending the human rights values, constitutional values, and paying huge prices for that over the years. We have already seen the Egyptian government being pressured and being forced to release some of the prisoners, political prisoners in the country, and to ease some of the crackdown on human rights activists. So far, these moves are very small. They don't really change the bigger picture, and they don't mean the revision of policies. But I believe with the continued effort and particularly when there is close coordination and cooperation between local and international civil societies, I think this can really produce fantastic results.
Thank you so much, Amr. And we're already seeing some of the good results of all those who defend human rights in Egypt, giving example the coalition on COP27 and everybody's work to make it successful and to amplify the petition's demands. This events and this discussion also came in support of this coalition's activities to support detainees' rights in Egyptian prisons, and we hope to continue our mobilization until we see real results and concrete steps from the government taking to solve the human rights crisis. Thank you so much to a brilliant panel of experts and speakers, not only brilliant, but also courageous. Thank you so much for everything you do. Samar Al-Husseini, Mr. Ahmed Salim and Mr. Amr Magdi. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us today, and we will be promoting this event and sharing it on the COP Civic Space website and publishing a written transcription as well. Thank you for your solidarity, and hopefully we'll see you soon in another coverage of the dire situations of human rights in Egypt. I am Yasmin Omar. Thank you so much for joining us today.
شكرا.
Thank you very much, Yasmin.
Thank you.